They think they're getting a little traction with the Signal controversy. Do you see that happening?
No, they try to get traction on every little thing. Donald Trump is going to order the wrong meal tomorrow or breathe the wrong way on Thursday. They'll talk about it for a month. The American people do not care.
There's a lot of interest in this story, all right? Google searches this week versus last week for these topics. For The Atlantic, how many people are searching for The Atlantic? Up 900%. That is the highest on record since Google searches began. They started tracking them back in 2004. How about for Signal, of course, the app on which this all occurred? Up over 1,000%. Again, the highest on record. It has gone up through the roof.
We'll talk about your shot and chaser. Initially, MAGA Republicans were smug about Signalgate or Whiskey Leaks, in which the Trump administration created the biggest national security breach in modern American history by inadvertently leaking highly sensitive, classified military intelligence to a reporter. Well, now the polls are coming in. The preliminary results are brutal for Republicans because it turns out the American people do care about this controversy. And now Republicans are panicking, and we have to talk about it. But before we do, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, as I said, the initial polling is brutal for Republicans on this issue, for the Trump administration. A majority of Americans are very concerned about this, and 75% are at least somewhat concerned. There's more concern about Signalgate or Whiskey Leaks than there was concern about Hillary Clinton's emails. To give you context, and we know how desperately Republicans tried to demagogue the shit out of that issue, and they were very successful. So Democrats should pounce on this relentlessly. But before we talk about that, let's have CNN's Harry Enton break down some of the polling, and we'll dive into it as well.
There's a lot of interest in this story, all right? Google searches this week versus last week for these topics. For The Atlantic, how many people are searching for The Atlantic? Up 900%. That is the highest on record since Google searches began. They started tracking them back in 2004. How about for Signal, of course, the app on which this all occurred? Up over 1,000%. Again, the highest on record. It has gone up through the roof on these two particular topics. Whether or not people ultimately end up caring and it changes their minds about the administration, that's one thing. But the interest at this particular point is absolutely there. People are interested in this story.
Right. Beyond the interest, their take on it, you don't read that in a Google search, but there is interest, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Trump's cabinet, obviously many of them are on this group chat. Many of them are facing a lot of scrutiny and questions right now. Trump's cabinet to this point before this was already on somewhat, I don't know, we call it thin ice with the American people. What do you have?
Absolutely. I mean, here we go. All right, disappointed with the administration appointments of these different presidents. You might notice only one of these presidents, only one of these terms that were a majority disappointed. Look at this. In 2025, 52% were already disappointed with Donald Trump's picks for his administration. That is the first time you get a majority. Back in 2017, it was only 44% for Donald Trump. Before that, you see 16, 17, 14. Joe Biden's picks were not, in fact, polled, but less than 40% disapproved in separate Pew polling. So the bottom line is, even going into this, there was already a lot of skepticism about Donald Trump's picks for his cabinet, for his appointments. There's no doubt in my mind that this number will almost certainly tick a little bit upwards because we already were dealing with a public that was quite skeptical. This story can only make things worse, Kate.
What about Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, specifically?
Yeah, obviously he's very much in the middle of this story, and I was interested.
Despite what the member of Congress just tried to tell John.
Despite what some Trump defenders try to say, if you were to speak to Spider Marks, for example, he would absolutely say that Pete Hegseth was right in the middle. And again, what you see here was the most unpopular defense secretary going all the way back. You have to go all the way back to Donald Rumsfeld, who, of course, was basically kind of forced out a little bit back in 2006. The unfavorable rating for Pete Hegseth, 42%, compared to this favorable rating that was only 30%. Many more Americans disliked Pete Hegseth coming into the scandal than liked him. Again, skeptical public. They're only going to probably become more skeptical.
So that's brutal. Okay, number one, interest is objectively through the roof on this, and Pete Hegseth's numbers are terrible. And I imagine this polling was before Signalgate as we know it. So that's why I want to dive into a recent YouGov poll about this, okay, which confirms that the American people, at least right now, are not only interested, but they do in fact care quite a bit. As Aaron Blake points out, the percentage who labeled these problems very serious, okay, in this new YouGov poll. President Biden's classified documents case, 30 to 39%, okay? Hillary Clinton's emails, 30 to 43%. Trump's classified documents, 42-49, right? In least to most serious order. So Biden's classified documents was the least concerning to people, or the least serious. and Trump's classified documents, very serious. But Signalgate trumps it all, pun intended, trumps it all. So we're going to dive into the particulars on the Signal chat leak. Just again, the percentage of people who find it very serious, spoiler alert, more than half, 53%. A majority of Americans find this very serious. But let's dive deeper. Signalgate chat leaks more serious than Clinton emails, Trump documents. The Trump team is treating this as no big deal. Early polling shows more Americans see it as a big deal than ever said the same of Clinton's and Trump's previous controversies. American politics in recent years has featured no shortage of high-impact controversies involving failures to protect sensitive and classified information. Former President Joe Biden's declining faculties came into focus last year amid an investigation into his mishandling of years-old classified documents. He later dropped out of his re-election race. Donald Trump was previously indicted for allegedly not just taking classified documents when his first term ended, but allegedly also illegally obstructing the return of them. And then there's an argument to be made that Trump may never have been president at all had it not been for his 2016 opponent Hillary Clinton's fateful decision to use a private email server, which sparked a lengthy investigation. The Trump administration's new Signal scandal is still fresh, but the early indication is that the American people think it's even worse than all three of those, and that could make the administration's never back down posture more difficult to maintain. YouGov is out with the first poll on the matter. It came after it was revealed on Monday that top Trump administration officials planned an attack on Yemen's Houthi rebels and on an unclassified Signal messaging app and inadvertently invited a prominent journalist. The journalist, Atlantic editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg, disclosed the fuller details of the messages on Wednesday after the Trump administration downplayed them. The details included precisely when the attacks would arrive and what aircraft and weapons would be used, the kind of information that could jeopardize the mission and American lives if it fell into the wrong hands. The poll found that about 3/4 of Americans, 74%, said the situation was at least somewhat serious, a somewhat serious problem. So again, before we go into the very serious, 3/4 of Americans, which it's hard to get them to agree on anything in these polarized times. 3/4 of Americans, or excuse me, 3/4 of Americans, 3/4 of Americans, fractions clearly not my strong suit, 3/4 of Americans say that it is at least somewhat serious. And if that wasn't bad enough for Trump, and a majority, 53%, said it was very serious. Stunning. Why is that noteworthy? Because that's higher than said the same of the Biden's classified documents, Trump's classified documents, or Clinton's server. Previous YouGov and CNN polling showed between 30% and 38% of Americans labeled Clinton's private email server a very serious problem when it was first revealed in 2015. The highest number on record appears to be 43% when the issue was polled again in 2022. For Trump's classified documents, the very serious number was generally in the 40s, 42% in a YouGov poll and 49% in a Quinnipiac University poll. And the more limited polling we have on Biden's classified documents case shows between 30 and 39% called it very serious. None of these matters eclipsed a majority labeling them very serious in these polls, but the Signal controversy has rather quickly. What's more, the new YouGov poll shows 28% of Republicans say this is a very serious problem, despite it being a problem for a Republican administration. That's higher than the highest percentage of Democrats to view Clinton's email server as a very serious problem, 19% in the 2022 YouGov poll. It's also higher than the highest percentage of Republicans to view the Trump's classified documents case as a very serious problem, 20% in a Reuters Ipsos poll last year. We'll await more data, but it's logical to believe that this mishandling of sensitive information might indeed be more concerning to Americans than its predecessors. While Clinton suffered from her email problems, that's largely because of the drip, drip, drip nature of revelations spread out at a wholly inopportune time during her 2016 campaign. The revelations were compounded by an 11th hour announcement of new evidence from then FBI Director James Comey in late October 2016. With Trump's documents, his problems were arguably less about him taking the documents in the first place than refusing to return them. Where the new Signal controversy seems to differ from the others is an easy-to-grasp potential impact. We don't know much about the contents of the emails Clinton exposed or the documents Trump and Biden had, nor do we have some specific mission or people we know could have been imperiled by the failure to secure this information. With the Signal messages, we now know the specific content of the messages, and it's not difficult to comprehend how this information falling into the wrong hands ahead of the Houthi strikes could have seriously harmed the mission or even cost people their lives. That didn't happen, but the peril of mishandling this particular type of sensitive information is more real and more easily grasped. Beyond that, it's possible that because this doesn't directly involve Trump personally, it would allow people to be a bit more honest with themselves and pollsters. Partisans never like to believe or admit their guy did something wrong. Perhaps it's easier for Republicans and Trump-leaning independents to say that National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth screwed up. Regardless of the reasons, it suggests this isn't going away. The White House can pretend all it likes that this isn't a big deal, but more people appear to believe it's a big deal than all of those other recent big deal controversies. And that makes it harder to play off and move without accountability. And this is an article, again, by, I believe, Aaron Blake. Yeah, analysis by Aaron Blake about recent YouGov polling. Disastrous for Donald Trump. Disastrous for the Trump administration. Disastrous for Pete Hegseth. Again, as Harry Enton pointed out in that second clip that I played, which is that his polling was disastrous even prior to Signalgate. Can't imagine what it's going to be like in a week or two. So let's play, since we mentioned the defense secretary and former Fox and Friends weekend co-host, I want you to see a couple of clips that I play in which Hegseth is doubling down on this idea that there was nothing classified and he did nothing wrong and everything is okay.
Strength, and we'll keep putting our troops first. Thank you very much. We're heading off
strike plans before they launched. Mr. Secretary, how do you square what you said with what your messages show? Mr. Secretary, did you share classified information? Mr. Secretary, did you declassify that information before you put it in the chat?
He doesn't seem particularly interested to answer. This clip should have been played first because it preceded the one I'm about to show you where he just cut and run. Get the hell out of there. Here's this other clip of Hegseth.
plans. And thank God we have those leaders who do it and do it well, and our enemies know it. My job, as it said atop of that, everybody's seen it now, team update is to provide updates in real time. General updates in real time. Keep everybody informed. That's what I did. That's my...
You sure did. You kept everybody informed, including the unauthorized editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. You sure did. But I think maybe you shouldn't keep everybody informed. Mr. Secretary, you should probably keep some people out of the loop, like journalists and unauthorized personnel. Maybe you should do that when it comes to advanced intelligence of a military strike in advance. You might want to do that on the appropriate channels, which is not the retail messaging app Signal, and you might want to exercise due diligence. Pretty pathetic. We all know if the shoe was on the other foot that Hegseth would be demagoguing the shit out of this issue. And for that reason, the hypocrisy of the Trump administration and MAGA Republicans, but more importantly, the polling on this. Democrats need to be ruthless, need to be vicious, need to be consistent, need to be relentless. Growing up in the South, there was always this bracelet that people wore in like elementary school, middle school, WWJD, what would Jesus do? I think Democrats should get a what would Republicans do bracelet, or what would Mitch McConnell do in this situation, and be, again, just relentless about this, because this is a substantively serious issue. I'm not saying that they should politicize a nothing burger. This is not a nothing burger. This is a colossal national security breach by the Trump administration that is squarely their fault, 100% their fault. It wasn't a failure in the sense of, a foreign adversary penetrated our national security and the Trump administration did everything they could to stop it. They just failed. That would still be a failure for which we could criticize them, but we could at least say, okay, well, there was an attempt to treat it seriously. This is 100% the failure of the Trump administration, but in a different way, in a malicious incompetence kind of way. Like, again, it wasn't like they tried to do the right thing or to do the responsible thing and failed. They actively created the irresponsible thing by stupidly inviting Jeffrey Goldberg to these messages and not noticing. That is indicative of gross incompetence, and yes, they should all be fired. Hegseth, Waltz, Tulsi Gabbard, John Ratcliffe, and others, or they should resign in disgrace. And Democrats, again, should be relentless in pounding this issue, give no quarter whatsoever, treat Republicans the way they would treat you if the shoe were on the other foot. That's what Democrats should do. And any Democrat who doesn't do that, I think should be primaried. I don't care if you're Chuck Schumer or whoever you are, a House or the Senate. You have an obligation to take this seriously and treat Republicans in this issue the way that they would treat you if the shoe was on the other foot. And a failure to do that means you don't belong in this party or an elected office, as far as I'm concerned. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.